All right, so we are here for our whistleblower chat, one of my favorite things that National Whistleblower Center does. I'm Siri Turner, the executive director at National Whistleblower Center, and I'm here with Kate Reeves. We're going to be talking about the International Anti-Corruption Conference, which Kate attended last month, but first, we'll go over some current events and hear about just Kate and who she is and why she's a good person for us to talk to about international anti-corruption efforts. So National Whistleblower Center is a nonprofit organization that advocates for whistleblowers. We've been doing this since 1988. So our website is whistleblowers.org. That's whistleblower with an S at the end, whistleblowers.org. And you can find us right here on LinkedIn, on YouTube, and on Twitter at Stop Fraud. You can also follow us on Instagram, where we have some pretty fun reels, and you can learn about events that we have locally, like our monthly trivia night, which just recently happened and will be happening next month in Washington, D.C. So we do have another important event coming up, National Whistleblower Day, which is on July 30th. And next month, we'll be talking a lot to have a National Whistleblower Day recap and hear from some of the folks that participated in National Whistleblower Day, organizing it, and as attendees. But before we continue talking about upcoming events and different whistleblower news, Kate, I would love to hear your self-introduction, your bio, who you are, how you've been involved with whistleblowing, and what's on your mind currently.
Absolutely, yeah. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me, Siri. I'm Kate. I am a senior law clerk and policy coordinator with Kohn Colapinto, which is a whistleblower law firm. And we work very closely with the National Whistleblower Center, doing a lot of pro bono advocacy work. So I've gotten to participate in a lot of our international work, as well as some of our domestic campaigns relating to improving regulations for the Anti-Money Laundering Whistleblower Improvement Act, trying to get better legislation passed for several important priority areas for whistleblowers, everything like that. Doing a lot of planning for National Whistleblower Day, so equally excited for July 30th. But yeah, I'm excited for our discussion.
Yes, I'm so happy you're here. So tell us a little bit about your background with advocacy and, how things were when you first got into this whistleblower space. What was your perception initially when you first came in the door at KKC?
Yeah, totally. I think one of the things that was really shocking to me when I came in the door just a year ago at KKC was how new the really effective whistleblower laws are, because obviously everybody knows the word whistleblower. We all have like whistleblower stories that come to our mind when somebody says whistleblower to you. So like whistleblowing as an activity has been around forever, but the kinds of whistleblower legislation that we work with transformed completely just after 2010 in the wake of the 2008 recession, when Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Act and created this transnational whistleblower reward model that was kind of replicating something that worked really well in a US law called the False Claims Act. And that was this notion that if you pay whistleblowers for their information, basically giving them a percentage of any sanctions that are recovered, and you allow them to report anonymously, it will lead to more reports and therefore more enforcement. And when Congress passed that whistleblower provision under the Dodd-Frank Act, I think it went almost as intended, but more. And there were all these consequences that spilled out from that nobody predicted. One of the main consequences of which was how many international whistleblowers began using this US law, because it enables anybody who, in the case of Dodd-Frank, has information about a US company, which is defined as any company where US investors can invest. So doesn't need to be activity that happens in the US, doesn't need to be a company that's headquartered in the US, doesn't need to be a whistleblower that is a US citizen. And nobody really predicted that. And nobody, therefore, was talking to Congress about how they should develop regulations that were suitable for international whistleblowers. But as soon as it happened, within just a decade, which is like this tiny lifespan in terms of the law, you see this like huge, the graph of like whistleblower reports goes from pretty flat to a really dramatic spike that has continued to increase readily over the past just over a decade now. And because we have all this empirical data showing how well the reward and anonymity framework work, Congress has begun to look at modeling other laws based off Dodd-Frank. And so that's really good on one hand. And a lot of our advocacy is based off of trying to replicate the Dodd-Frank framework for other laws in the US, in other countries that are trying to develop similar laws. And then on the other hand, there are all these kinks that we're sorting out that nobody predicted. Like, for instance, if you are an international whistleblower, you may not understand the difference between reporting to the Securities and Exchange Commission versus reporting to the FBI. So if you hear that there's this transnational whistleblower program under US law, it requires a lot of nuance to understand exactly where you have to report to maintain your rights as a whistleblower and to get the best enforcement as a result of your information. But whistleblowers, are in their own crises. They're probably facing a lot of risk when they report. They're making this huge decision already. They don't have the time or necessarily the resources to be finding this information. So all that to say, another part of our advocacy is on fixing some of the problems that we have identified in the Dodd-Frank framework and trying to get all these disparate laws that now exist to work together and to educate people on what they need to be aware of. Like every year when the OECD comes out with their audit on the Anti-Bribery Convention, they've recommended that the US does training on how whistleblowers can use the laws because it is incredibly confusing. And that confusion has been obvious to external trusted auditors like the OECD. But the training to the extent that is necessary hasn't happened yet. So that's another thing we're advocating for.
So you talked a lot about the law and how you've grown to understand it. So it sounds like the gateway for you was just realizing the existence of the programs and how effective they were and seeing that sea change that happened once rewards were introduced.
Mm-hmm.
And then you just kind of went in and learned more and more and more. And, just working with you on all the different advocacy projects that you've participated in, I know you've interacted with lots of whistleblowers in the advocacy efforts that we've done, but also as a member of the staff at KKC. So I know that as a person who works at a law firm, there are certain things you are not able to share. But, thinking through the year, what are some qualities about whistleblowers that you find striking or unexpected?
That's a good question. I'm going to give you kind of a double response that seems like an oxymoron, but on one hand, I think I'm perpetually in awe of the people that we work with, like the types of things that whistleblowers do, the things they're up against, and the fact that they are still reporting them. And then also even being completely aware, like part of why I went into this space is because I have a lot of problems with the ways that corruption impacts all kinds of things. And yet even knowing a lot of the brevity of that, I've been continuously shocked at some of like the intensely corrupt schemes that are like the architecture of everything that we do, whether it's like social media, various businesses, various government agencies, like all these things that we're always interacting with, just learning about some of the corruption within them is so deeply alarming. And then therefore the people who are standing up to such an intrinsically rooted system, it's like I have this deep appreciation for the people we work with. And then on the other hand, I think I have also seen how this narrative of whistleblowers as heroes sometimes gets in the way of us being able to do what whistleblowers actually need. Like I think because whistleblowers are so impressive and brave, and many of the whistleblowers who we know and owe so much to are people who are rightly held up on a pedestal. I think because of that, we hear whistleblowers and we think these are people who will always, whenever there's corruption, there's going to be a good person who's going to risk it all to report wrongdoing. And that's not true. And that's why we have these deeply rooted systems of corruption that exist, is because in order for that information that thrives in secrecy to come out, there needs to be somebody who oftentimes is willing to throw their salary on the line, their mental health on the line, put their job aside. It's not like people ended up in these jobs because they didn't like them in the first place and they were trying to like be a spy. Like a lot of people love their work. They got into their work because they wanted to do whatever it is where they found out about the wrongdoing happening. They want to stay employed there. They have families to feed. They have mortgages to pay. They have all these responsibilities. And so even some of the best of people need additional circumstances in order to feel comfortable blowing the whistle. And so I think two of the things that I have experienced working here is, on one hand, like the constant state of awe, and on the other hand, like seeing how this hero narrative of whistleblowers gets in the way of us actually doing what whistleblowers need, like paying rewards to incentivize whistleblowers to bring forward information and provide that financial safety net, like guaranteeing anonymity, like providing training so that whistleblowers in countries where these rights aren't as developed know about their ability to use transnational laws to report and to lead to enforcement, all of those things.
That's a pretty great thing that you have such a reverent perspective of whistleblowers, and it really does invoke the energy that we intend to bring on National Whistleblower Day as we celebrate whistleblowers. So I hope everybody in the audience really is excited about the event and can see that the people involved are really and truly heartfelt and supporting whistleblowers from a genuine place. One of the things that comes to mind for me, because you're talking about something that I think is really great for people to consider seriously, which is that there's an assumption that where there is wrongdoing, truth will prevail or truth will come out and expose itself. And I think that's something that gives us a little bit of comfort to believe that, oh, I don't have to be so stressed about the world because there's always going to be someone who can speak up or will speak up. And you make such a good point to note that if that were the case, corruption would not be so well entrenched in our societies and in our economies. We would not be seeing issues with rule of law if it were the case that when something's wrong, someone will inevitably speak up, especially not in time to stop the wrongdoing from causing irreparable harm. So the courage it takes to blow the whistle is important, but as you highlight, with incentives, it increases the likelihood that someone will speak up and be willing to sacrifice or at least put at risk the things that they've worked so hard to obtain. However, on the other hand, something does come to mind when I think about recent developments with employment culture in especially corporate America. And I think this is something that's kind of global. When you mentioned the concept of people not going to jobs because they plan to do something they don't like to do, they don't want to go just to be spies, and nobody grows up saying, when I grow up, I'm going to blow the whistle on a major corporation. You just wait and see. However, I feel like sometimes corporations set themselves up to be the subject of whistleblower complaints.
Totally.
Especially those that make representations that they are somehow doing better than others in terms of ethics, environmental considerations, There's a lot of greenwashing and DEI washing, I guess you can say, that happens and results in folks speaking up because they go to jobs being told that they will be able to make a positive impact. For example, at Exxon,
Mhm.
I've heard from more than one that they were attracted to their job at Exxon because during the interview process, Exxon was making it clear that part of their role would be to improve the impact on the environment that Exxon had, and that they had the highest level of honesty and integrity, only to work at Exxon for a few years and find out that it was all just fluff.
Right.
So I wonder if you've seen, because you've been able to work with whistleblowers from so many different economic realities and generations.
Mhm.
So I wonder if you've seen or noted any differences between people who began their employment life in the earlier part of the 20th century versus people who are just entering their careers today. I know at National Whistleblower Day, we'll have representation from folks who, started their first job in, the 1960s, and people who started their first job in the early 2000s or 2010s. So we'll hear from a lot of different voices, but what's your perception in terms of differences with people in different generations and how they view and experience whistleblowing?
It's a really interesting question. Honestly, I feel like I have noticed more similar trends than different trends, though I'm gonna try to be thinking of if there's anything that stands out as a major difference. But I think that across generations, the the thing that stays the same is a lot of whistleblowers who are having the kind of experience that you described, like they got into a role because they thought they were doing one thing and they realized a little while in they were doing something else. And so now they have this information about wrongdoing, but there's also this piece that will hold a lot of people back from reporting across generations, which is by the time they realize it frequently, they've been involved in the crime to some extent. Like if you are at the level where you have information about a fraud scheme or about a bribe that was paid or about a money laundering scheme, whatever it is, if you're at that level where you're witnessing it, you're probably only able to witness it through your participation in it to some extent. And I have noticed whether it's our clients or even like folks at National Whistleblower Day last year, something that comes up in the initial meetings every time is this fear about whether whistleblowers will get themselves in trouble by reporting. And I think that's why one of the most important parts of whistleblower laws are protecting whistleblowers by not creating this framework where it's like the company versus the whistleblower. Like it should never be any kind of labor dispute mechanism or any situation where the whistleblower themselves is going to be in a case against a company that obviously has more money, more power than them because they can raise all these things against the whistleblower, like their participation, et cetera. But the kinds of whistleblower laws that we tend to work in allow whistleblowers to report anonymously to the government so that it's the government going against a corporation or whatever entity is liable or responsible for the corruption. And they also protect the whistleblower by allowing like they're not going to go after the whistleblower criminally as long as they're not like the kingpin of the scheme. So I think in many ways the fears that different generations experience are very similar. I think probably something that has changed generation to generation is like the society's broader interpretation of a whistleblower, which may make folks more or less inclined to report. Although, honestly, I think the likelihood of reporting has more to do with folks' own assessment of their personal risk than, how they think they'll be perceived by others. Although I'm sure that has a role to play.
Absolutely. That's such a great insight, Kate. I really like how you thread the needle on that no matter where you are in your, generational reality, no one wants to get in trouble. And it's definitely important to reduce the deterrent to blowing the whistle by minimizing the fear of retribution, retaliation, and criminal prosecution as a result of blowing the whistle. So that's something that, we've worked a lot in the advocacy space around the anti-retaliation aspect and making sure that there's an understanding for how important it is that anti-retaliation provisions are in fact enforced to stop companies from retaliating against whistleblowers when they do blow the whistle. But there's still major concerns about the way the government handles whistleblowers, especially federal employee whistleblowers who blow the whistle about government misconduct and fraud, waste, and abuse in the government. We've seen a huge backlog at the MSPB, which is slowly getting cleared out. However, it's still not come to where it should be in terms of current cases being addressed. And we just continue to see federal whistleblowers come forward and fear retribution from the government. I can imagine that, we also understand that with these corporate whistleblowers, if the anti-retaliation provisions are not being enforced, we're going to see less people willing to speak up. So, for example, there was a recent Supreme Court case, the Murray versus UBS versus Murray case, where the Supreme Court decided that, retaliation for whistleblowing can be considered even if it's just a contributory factor rather than the core and sole factor. So that helps people, be able to seek anti-retaliation protections when they've been fired or demoted or otherwise suffered some sort of retaliatory or consequential action after blowing the whistle. So, I mean, that's a really exciting development for whistleblowers. It helps them feel like anti-retaliation provisions are more within reach, even when there's other reasons they might be facing discipline, like showing up to work late or being rude to their boss because they know their boss is involved in some sort of crime. So those are the things that are really great to see happen. However, the laws don't really include specific provisions that protect whistleblowers from facing criminal prosecution. There might be some internal rules and there might be some internal policies around not prosecuting whistleblowers, like you mentioned, unless they're the kingpin. But that's such a murky standard that really needs to be improved. And I think we've, really done a good job making that case for the DOJ as they've approached developing their whistleblower program. Interestingly, the 90-day sprint has not resulted in a plan, although we have had many people taking action. So thank you for all of our subscribers who took action in terms of our 90-day plan. We did receive a letter from the DOJ mentioning that they are supporting National Whistleblower Day and want to really, highlight the value of whistleblowing within their agency. So that's good. But we'd love to see a plan. And one of the things that you mentioned that came up, in a lot of our advocacy and our letters to the DOJ are, you can't expect people not to be involved in the crime in any way, right? And that was one of the rules that they proposed. They wanted to be able to create a program where only non-culpable whistleblowers were able to
Which again is one of these misconceptions about whistleblowers that comes from us holding whistleblowers, again, often rightly so, on a pedestal. But if the goal is anti-corruption prosecution, the goal is not to have the perfect quintessential whistleblower come forward. The goal is to get information that leads to anti-corruption enforcement. And a lot of times the people who have that information can be flawed, can have a complicated history with that corruption. And our question should not be, in my opinion, is it fair for those whistleblowers to be eligible for whistleblower rewards? The question is it fair that there are these massive corruption schemes happening with victims who have no power to know about it or to have the information that can force a company to stop that corruption or to pay for that corruption, et cetera? And so if we can incentivize the people who have that power to come forward, that should be the goal of an enforcement agency. And the one other thing that you mentioned that I wanted to touch on is the lack of protections for federal whistleblowers, which lag completely behind the protections that the U.S. has for white-collar crime whistleblowers. But just, I think last week, Senator Blumenthal introduced the Congressional Whistleblower Protection Act, which would provide whistleblowers that are summoned by Congress or who provide information to Congress the right to bring their cases to court, essentially. There was like a Supreme Court case, I think, back in the 70s, but don't quote me, where they took away that right whistleblowers used to have to bring the case to court. And it seems like Congress never necessarily intended that to be the case based on basically after Watergate, Congress wrote a bill to kind of clean up the civil service. And it didn't necessarily mention the right of federal whistleblowers taking their case to court, but it did create the MSPB system that Siri mentioned, which doesn't necessarily need to be mutually exclusive. But this Congressional Whistleblower Protection Act would make it clear that whistleblowers who disclose information to Congress have that right, which should be like whistleblowing 101. Like you would think we're so far ahead in the white collar whistleblowing space, we would make sure that whistleblowers who are clearly some of the most important whistleblowers, if Congress is working with them, if they have information pertinent to national security, et cetera, the basic right to bring their case to court.
Agreed. And it's great to see that there at least has been some improvements. I mean, the MSPB does have quorum. And also really importantly and notably is that the recently appointed new special counsel at the Office of Special Counsel, Hampton Dillinger, is extremely engaged with whistleblower advocates and people who are doing the type of work that we do, and also has sent a letter to express his support for National Whistleblower Day, and also include the recognition of National Whistleblower Day in his evaluation of recertification for agencies and their compliance with their, goals at Office of Special Counsel. So that's really good. And we see that recently appointed as well is Henry Kerner, who is a newly appointed member of the MSPB. And he was the Office of Special Counsel's special counsel and has been very whistleblower friendly and has spoken for National Whistleblower Day celebrations. We have his recorded statements on our YouTube page. And he's just like a very aware guy about whistleblower issues. So it's great to see him on the MSPB board and helping to get through these cases. We also see former members of the board now working at whistleblower advocacy organizations. Tristan Levitt, who used to be a board member at MSPB, is now the director of Empower, which is also a whistleblower advocacy group that we hope to see really great things come out of. So it's amazing how, yes, there are a lot of places where there's room for improvement in the US government, but there's also a lot of whistleblower advocates there. So
yeah, and like you said with the DOJ thing, I think there's also a lot of spaces where there's whistleblower advocates who are trying to do things and don't yet understand what the best practices are, which is where whistleblower organizations like National Whistleblower Center and like all the other CSOs that exist for whistleblowers really come into play. Because I think as a whistleblower community, we did a very effective job of communicating to the Department of Justice that some of the initial goals that they laid out in their proposal for the 90-day sprint were just completely not aligned with best practice. And then also letting them know like what the major priorities are, what has worked in Dodd-Frank, what they should seek to replicate. And yeah, like you said, that 90-day sprint hasn't exactly panned out. Maybe it's more of a marathon, but hoping to see that program finalized soon.
yeah, I agree. And I think the sprint not panning out is a sign of the agency erring on some better judgment.
Yeah, and putting
really...
the time that's necessary for sure.
Absolutely. I mean, 90 days is absolutely not enough unless you're literally going to copy and paste the Dodd-Frank Act. So I'm happy to see that they're spending more time mulling over it, but it's also a fun thing to poke fun at that they put a 90-day deadline out there, and hopefully got a lot of feedback from the community, and we're really looking forward to seeing what happens next. But similarly, we see the anti-money laundering whistleblower program, which has been, garnering feedback from whistleblower advocates, including NWC and with the support of KKC, yet there still isn't enough clarity around how the program operates. They're understaffed, and there's so many missed opportunities happening on the global scale. So before we jump into talking about the international engagement that you've had, just some brief reviews of current events, things that have happened since last month's Whistleblower Chat, where we spoke with Justin Smolison about the year in review. So if you want to know more about some news stories from earlier this year, please go check that out. It's on our YouTube page. And you can also check out our press releases at whistleblowers.org and check our recent updates on Instagram at National Whistleblower Center and on Twitter at Stop Fraud. The biggest thing on my radar in terms of news is the reversal of Chevron, which is a really significant decision for whistleblowers because most whistleblower programs are governed by administrative agencies. And Chevron was finding an opinion that held that, the court should defer to the reasoning of administrative agencies because they know their agencies call the best. And now the Supreme Court decided that that's not the case. So we are already seeing reversals. We see an IRS case, LISAC, go back, but luckily that could potentially be great for the whistleblower. NWC filed an amicus brief in LISAC's case and argued that LISAC was entitled to an award when the IRS said that he wasn't. And courts affirmed the IRS's decision based on Chevron and the deference that needed to be paid to the IRS decision-making process. So hopefully now LISAC gets another chance to see justice and get a reward for the important information he contributed to a large IRS recovery. But we won't necessarily see this positive impact across the board with whistleblowing and whistleblower cases. One thing that's going to be really important is that legislators going forward are very clear with their language and that there's a strong congressional record showing a congressional intent for the best practices that we advocate for, like anti-retaliation, anonymity, and rewards. But with that being said, we still have all these laws that are currently in existence and need to be interrogated in terms of their possible weaknesses and loopholes, and whistleblower attorneys need to be poised to continue to fight zealously for their clients and make sure that they start to really interrogate the legislative record for the laws that they're using. Another thing that's going on that's very interesting in the tech industry space, we've seen a lot of stories around non-disclosure agreements that are being used, but now we see a story coming out of OpenAI, which is a major, huge company that creates artificial intelligence products. They are most well known for their product ChatGPT, which some of you may be familiar with. I'm sure any teachers who are watching this are very familiar with the tool that can be used to forge all sorts of especially written documents. And unfortunately, some lawyers have even used it to create their briefs and got caught red-handed. So this is a really interesting story from OpenAI whistleblowers. I love to see tech industry whistleblowers. It's something that just lights my heart up because the tech industry has such a big impact on our economy and our lives, our day-to-day lives. So it's really important that those companies operate with integrity and that there's adequate oversight. Oftentimes, people who go to work at tech industry jobs are very optimistic. They're very positive. They think what they're doing is going to have a positive impact on the world. And what we've seen with the whistleblowers like Thomas Labaniak, Frances Haugen, I'm sure there's so many. I forget the one from Pinterest. Ifoma, I forgot her last name. But there's so many people, and it's just amazing how positive they go into their jobs and how starkly the reality of their jobs contrasts with what they expected to be contributing to, as we discussed earlier.
Yeah,
So what do you think about this story?
OpenAI is such a perfect example of all the trends that we were talking about earlier.
Are you surprised?
No, not at all. Not at all. I think whistleblowing is particularly necessary and even more high risk in industries that are new and have less regulation. And it also leaves whistleblowers wondering like what they can blow the whistle on because the regulations are so far behind. Like in the finance field, there's so many regulations that govern the market. And even though there's, a million risks that threaten whistleblowers, it is pretty clear at the end of the day, like, is a company allowed to do this? Is this an SEC violation? Things like that tend to be better understood by the types of whistleblowers we see in the finance space. In the artificial intelligence space, there are virtually no federal regulations yet. And so if you are, as Siri described, a very optimistic young or old tech professional at OpenAI, you go into it thinking that you're creating this really impactful, innovative tool, and you end up doing or being forced to sign, in this case, something that you can clearly tell is wrong. It can be much more difficult to navigate like how you report and what your rights are. And actually in this case, we see like a repetition of something that has happened in a lot of white collar spaces, which is that the whistleblowers were forced to sign an illegal non-disclosure agreement, which basically said that whistleblowers couldn't, allegedly said that whistleblowers couldn't go to federal regulators with problems. And the agreement that they had to sign listed some pretty severe problems that they were not allowed to report. So again, just case in point in the fact that whistleblowers are so crucial in these spaces, but have so much trouble navigating, don't know what their rights are. A lot of these whistleblowers were so nervous about coming forward because, I mean, picture, like you literally sign a non-disclosure agreement. You think that it's, like nobody has told you that once you sign what you think is a legally binding contract to not report, you actually have the right to report. It's extremely counterintuitive. There needs to be so much more education on like how illegal NDAs work, everything related to non-disclosure agreements. And I know my colleagues at KKC have been working around the clock to work on the OpenAI case. So I'm really excited to see how it pans out.
Yeah, I'm excited too. And I remember, when I was working with clients directly, a lot of them that came through from tech industry, even if what they were reporting wouldn't give rise to any sort of government action, they almost always had illegal NDAs.
Mm-hmm.
And back then, the Securities and Exchange Commission was not taking it seriously at all. But last year, we've seen a bit of a change in the agency's decision making.
Yeah, the SEC has been enforcing illegal non-disclosure agreements from both public companies and private companies, and now it has responded to this case on OpenAI. So we're seeing it across the board.
And that's a really encouraging thing because it increases public awareness. I think, teaching at Northeastern, one of the most prevalent questions that we receive from students is about, whether or not the NDAs they may sign or have clients that have signed NDAs, or whether or not they're enough to silence those clients from moving forward and blowing a whistle. And the answer resoundingly is no. You cannot have an NDA that restricts people from reporting to the appropriate authorities. Now, that's quite different when we talk about reporting to the media or telling your friends and family, but it's always important to get a lawyer and figure out the details of who you can talk to and about what, regardless of which NDA you've signed. You can always talk to an attorney about these matters. And I would want to take this moment to highlight the fact that NWC does have a referral program. So if you happen to be tuning in today and you are in the position that you need legal help, please go to our website, whistleblowers.org, and click on Get Help to learn more about our referral network. By signing up and sharing your information in our confidential form, you can be connected with an attorney if there's someone in our network that is able to help you. If you contact us directly at NWC, if you send me an email, or if you put something in the chat, it is not confidential. We don't have any sort of encryption on LinkedIn. And there is also no way for us to help you other than to refer you to our referral program to fill out that confidential intake form. So again, if you need help and you're especially thinking that you might have signed an NDA that could be illegal, just go online, whistleblowers.org, click on Get Help, fill out the form, and hopefully we'll be able to connect you with an attorney. If you're an attorney watching this and you want to get involved with our referral network, we also have a form for that. So if you go to our website at whistleblowers.org and you click on I think it's take action, and then you see a drop down box that will let you join and learn more about our referral network and how you can join. We are currently recruiting attorneys, so everybody, if you have any interest or experience in the whistleblower area, we'd love to talk to you. I just wanted to throw that out there because I know that we talk about whistleblower stories and then, people realize like, hey, that happened to me, or, I have a similar story. So, for everyone who has a similar story, there could be help out there. And the best place to look for that is by filling out the form. But I'm really like curious about what is going to happen with the tech industry, with these illegal NDAs, with SEC enforcement. I wonder, if there is ever going to be a change in the culture in the tech industry without extra laws being created. I know that legislation around artificial intelligence has been, widely discussed in Congress, but due to lobbying efforts, I believe that it has continuously been shut down, which is very unfortunate. But I hope to see a whistleblower program specifically for folks who are dealing in artificial intelligence, generative AI, and helping to protect the public from the threats that could be possible in terms of privacy threats, public safety threats, mental health threats, all the other things that we've seen whistleblowers speak up about in this space. And I think that kind of gives us a good chance to pivot to talking about your global work. The tech industry definitely does touch every corner of this planet, and so does our advocacy. So you've been able to engage in a lot of international global advocacy, specifically recently going to the IACC conference as part of NWC's delegation. But let's go even further back, because you've done so much in the past year. Tell us about just all the different things you've been able to participate in and some of the highlights.
Yeah, totally. So I guess starting the first international engagement that I did was the Conference of States Parties in Atlanta, the 10th COSP, which was back in 2023, but which laid a really good groundwork coming into the International Anti-Corruption Conference this year. I think usually the two are a little bit more space because COSP is, I think they're both usually once every 2 years, but this year they moved IACC a bit earlier so that we could enjoy the summer of Lithuania rather than the winter of Lithuania, which was much appreciated. But anyways, it was really great to be able to start off at COSP and really meet a lot of folks who are interested in whistleblowing and see the connections between the work that we do in whistleblowing and anti-corruption enforcement and how that overlaps with folks in the environmental crime and corruption space, how that overlaps with folks who are exclusively focused on anti-money laundering, all these connections. And I feel like over the past year, we've really been able to dig deeper into some of those connections, and it culminated in a lot of really good work at IACC. I also was able to go to the second whistleblowing week this year in the UK, which was organized by Whistleblowers UK. And that was really exciting to see because the United Kingdom is it had already kind of been at this climactic point of they're right on the verge of hopefully getting a new whistleblower framework passed. And now with the recent elections in the UK and the Labour Party coming to power, hopefully it creates a new momentum for getting a really important new piece of legislation passed. But there have been all these little pieces over the past year that have really helped garner support for that movement. I think there were a couple scandals, unfortunately, in the UK that led to the revelation that, okay, our system under the Public Interest Disclosure Act is what it's called in the UK. It's not working. There was the Lucy Letby case, which I'm sure many people heard of. It was the nurse at the NHS who killed 7 babies, and there had been whistleblowers who had raised complaints and who were basically either silenced or they were sent to this, what, like, the place where PETA directs whistleblowers is basically like a labor dispute court, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a place for a worker to work out a problem with their employer. It's not a place for enforcement. And so the UK's whistleblower system is not designed in any way to actually address the wrongdoing that whistleblowers are reporting. It's set up to address the retaliation that happens, and it does a very poor job at doing that. Only 4% of whistleblowers actually win their case in the employment tribunal, and even those lucky few who win oftentimes are in so much debt from their legal fees that they can't even pay off the money that they lost from being fired from their job or any other financial consequences that they suffered from retaliation. So there was the Lucy Letby scandal, there was the post office scandal, and I think those two things happening at the same time just woke up the public and made people realize, okay, the Public Interest Disclosure Act is not working. And at that point, like I mentioned earlier, we have this, what should be a relatively short time frame of data from the Dodd-Frank Act, but because it's been so effective, has shown tremendously well the efficacy of the reward system. And so a lot of UK parliamentarians and regulators have woken up to the fact that having an independent whistleblower office, potentially incentivizing whistleblowers, could be a really successful way to transition. So Whistleblowers UK has been advocating for an Office of the Whistleblower Bill, and I think they've been having a lot of success over the past year. So it's great to be over there to talk more about what does a rewards framework look like? What does a separate whistleblower office look like? I think folks are still having a lot of discussion, debate about the rewards aspect of everything in the UK. I know RUSI, which is a think tank in the UK, a really prominent think tank, is coming out with a report on whistleblower rewards soon. So we're excited for that to come out. And I think it will have a lot to say about rewards. And the UK's director of their serious fraud office recently announced that they would potentially be looking to reward whistleblowers. And we don't know for sure, but we credit that to the high number of whistleblowers from the UK that are using the US reward law. So 700 whistleblowers in just the 10 years after Dodd-Frank used the SEC whistleblower program to report. So that's a lot of information that UK enforcement officers are receiving rather than US enforcement officers are receiving rather than UK. So yeah, those developments have been very exciting. And then I also was able to travel to India back in February for the Constitution Unity Conference in Bangalore, and that was celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Constitution. And there was a closed door session organized by MKSS, which is a activist group that is responsible for getting the right to information passed in India, and that's India's most significant whistleblower law, and it's really transformed what whistleblowers in India are able to do. It's in some ways comparable to the Freedom of Information Act in the United States, but really is much more powerful and allows whistleblowers to access information, like basically request information from government agencies, and kind of like democratizes whistleblowing by allowing people from the public, when they have a sense that there's corruption going on, to request the records and be able to become the analysts themselves in terms of identifying, was their money improperly removed? Has the public received all the money for a project that they're supposed to have received, etc. So RTI was passed a while ago, but is facing a lot of threats now. And the folks at the conference were discussing how we can increase international solidarity to support RTI and whistleblower laws around the world in the face of governments that are trying to deteriorate really effective whistleblower laws. And I think the conversation taking place at the Constitution and Unity Conference, which was celebrating the Indian Constitution, was this reminder of how essential whistleblowers are to protecting democracy. So that was really interesting to participate in and learn from everybody there and provide insights about how whistleblowing has worked in the United States.
This is so awesome, Kate. You've just done so much in so little time, and you're so good with like communicating with people and such a great advocate for whistleblowers. So I'm really grateful for all the work you've done, and I'm so excited to hear now about ICC. How's Lithuania? What happened? What do we all need to know for those of us who were not there?
It was great. The International Anti-Corruption Conference I was so impressed with Transparency International's organization and how much they were able to fit into just 4 days. Through National Whistleblower Center, we were able to participate in like 3 different sessions, 2 that were a formal part of the conference and 1 side event that we had organized outside. So the first side event that was part of the conference was with a group of fellow whistleblower activists, and we had a conversation about the role of whistleblowing in enforcement, which I think is great because, again, like the name of the conference, International Anti-Corruption Conference, and so often we talk about whistleblowing removed from the anti-corruption component, but to center the conversation about whistleblowing in terms of the question, like what actually works, was really good and I think very stimulative for the audience. And Steve, who's the chairman of the board at the National Whistleblower Center, talked about these laws and gave kind of a teaser about all the information that exists out there and how well they work and all of that. And then at the event that National Whistleblower Center organized on the side, Steve was able to provide more insights and kind of a more nuanced training on how the laws work and what anti-corruption advocates should be aware of in terms of transmitting information to the folks they work with on the ground. Because like I mentioned earlier, so few people know that these laws exist, and it can truly transform what whistleblowers or potential whistleblowers do with the information they have. Like sometimes when we go to these conferences and we talk about the laws, it just completely shocks people because some of the people in the audience have been witnesses to the types of crimes that could qualify for information that you could report under these programs. But in many countries, like you can't do anything with that information unless you're willing to literally risk your life. So knowing that there's a place to report to, that you can be completely protected and you can even receive a reward, it is a complete game changer for so many people. So that training session was really great. And I know we strive to do a lot of those all over. And we work very closely with the State Department's IVLP program to do those here in DC. And then the last session that we did, huge shout out to Tec de Monterrey and ITAM, particularly to Angeles Estrada, who organized this research group. But we discussed the role of whistleblowing in the fight against corruption in deep sea mining, which was personally my favorite part of the whole thing because I am very passionate about the intersection of anti-corruption and environmental crime. And I think a lot of people like kind of know about deep sea mining, like it's maybe a word that you've heard of, a thing that you know exists, but I don't think people realize the extent of corruption that exists within the International Seabed Authority. And like the ocean is kind of our last frontier of land that has not been exploited. And the way in which the exploration of the deep sea is now forming in a highly corrupt manner, completely counterintuitive to the design of the ISA and of deep sea mining exploration that was created, and the blueprint that was laid out under UNCLOS UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. Um, it's shocking, and it happens in secret, I think even more so because it's literally in the deep sea. So whistleblowers become even more essential. And the fact that the deep sea is no country's jurisdiction, again, makes it so that a lot of whistleblowers are left wondering like who they can report to. And the transnational laws become a really effective option. I'm happy to talk more. I could talk forever about deep sea mining and the corruption in the International Seabed Authority, but I don't know how much more time we have, so you can let me know.
Yeah, you're so intuitive. We're coming to the end of our time together, actually. But I definitely want to encourage everyone to check out Whistleblower Network News, whistleblowersblog.org, where you can actually find information that Kate has shared already and has written. She's a contributor to the Whistleblower Network News website, and she's got some really great stories there. So if you've liked what you've heard from Kate so far, go ahead and check out whistleblowersblog.org and read some of her stories. I don't know how much you've written about deep sea mining and whistleblowing in that area, but
I don't have anything on Whistleblower Network News right now, but I have an article on the National Law Review on deep sea mining that covers basically all the main points. So definitely would recommend taking a look at that if anybody's interested on that whistleblower deep sea mining nexus.
yes, I think it's a great thing to focus on, and NWC has been doing work in emerging areas around climate, wildlife protection, whistleblower rules, and this is just an extension of that work that we've been doing in our partnership with Tech de Monterrey. And I just also want to highlight our other partners, the Nature Crime Alliance, and also the Wildlife Justice Coalition. So, no, is it coalition? Commission. Thank you. I was like, I know that's not the right word. So anything you want to say as your last parting words, Kate, as we wrap up our whistleblower chat this week?
I think just like as we're wrapping up the conversation on deep sea mining and just having talked about the OpenAI case, just highlighting the particular salience of whistleblowing in industries that are lagging behind in regulations because they're so new. And frequently, when I talk to people who don't know anything about whistleblowing or anti-corruption, I think folks' reaction, hearing like whistleblowing and deep sea mining in the same sentence is like, what do those things have to do with each other? And the answer is that like wherever regulations are lagging, wherever there's corruption, whistleblowers are extremely important and are necessary for raising problems that we don't even know exist yet because we may not even have the regulations that demand that information or who are holding companies accountable for that information. So really, just as we come up on National Whistleblower Day, I think being extra cognizant of all these seemingly niche areas where whistleblowers are quite literally protecting the public and protecting the planet and doing these ginormous jobs. I think the more we have a recognition and a respect for those things, the more we're able to create legislation and programs and training for whistleblowers that actually meet the needs of whistleblowers and of anti-corruption demands.
Well said. Yes, we have so much that we need to continue to build on. Thank you so much for being here, Kate. It's been wonderful to talk with you. You have so many great insights on whistleblowing. Thank you to everyone who's tuning in for our whistleblower chat. We love these conversations, and with your help, we can continue to have them. So please donate to National Whistleblower Center today. Visit whistleblowers.org and click on donate to make sure we can keep on having these impactful conversations. Join us on July 30th for National Whistleblower Day and enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you, Kate.